Throughout the war years of 1943 to 1946, the United States held more than 370,000 German prisoners of war in camps scattered across nearly every state in the Union. The inspection reports, prisoner testimonies, intelligence surveys, and camp records now preserved in the National Archives reveal a pattern so absurd, so deeply contradictory, that many German prisoners themselves could not believe what they were witnessing. The enemy soldiers who had fought to destroy democracy were eating in American restaurants, lounging at American truck stops, blowing kisses to American girls, and using American facilities marked whites only. Meanwhile, the black American soldiers assigned to guard them, the men who had volunteered to die, defending that same democracy, were forced to enter through the back door, drink from separate fountains, and wait outside while their prisoners used the restroom. What these German prisoners of war were discovering about America would become one of the most damning testimonies against Jim Crow ever recorded. Not because civil rights activists wrote it, because the enemy did. The story of how Nazi prisoners received better treatment than the American soldiers guarding them did not unfold in a single dramatic moment. It accumulated across hundreds of camps, thousands of daily humiliations, and millions of small decisions made by a country fighting fascism abroad while practicing its own version at home. And nowhere was this contradiction more visible, more concentrated, and more explosive than at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, where German prisoners of war and African-American service members lived on the same base, separated by barbed wire and a set of rules that treated the enemy with more dignity than the defenders. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the machinery that brought it about. By 1943, the United States was winning the war in North Africa, and that meant a flood of prisoners. Rommel's Panzerarmee Afrika was collapsing. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, many of them veterans of years of desert warfare, were surrendering to American and British forces. They needed to go somewhere. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States had signed, required that prisoners of war be held in conditions comparable to those of the captor's own troops. They had to be fed, clothed, sheltered, given medical care, and protected from violence. Enlisted prisoners could be required to work, but they had to be paid. Officers could not be forced to work at all. The War Department needed camps, and it needed them fast. The American South offered several advantages. The climate was warm enough to reduce construction costs. The agricultural economy desperately needed labor to replace the men who had left for the military or the war factories. And the existing military bases scattered across southern states provided ready-made infrastructure. Louisiana alone would eventually house 44 prisoner-of-war base and branch camps. Some of the earliest German prisoners from Rommel's Afrika Korps arrived in Louisiana in 1943, blinking in the humid subtropical air that was as foreign to them as the landscape of central Louisiana. Camp Claiborne sat 20 miles south of Alexandria, Louisiana, spread across 3,100 acres with 684 buildings and 7,000 tents. Before the war, it had served as one of the staging grounds for the Louisiana maneuvers of 1940 and 1941, the massive training exercises where Patton and Eisenhower and Bradley and the other generals who would win the war first learned how to move armies across difficult terrain. The 101st Airborne Division was activated at Camp Claiborne on August 16, 1942. The 82nd Airborne Division reorganized there the same year. Both would parachute into France on D-Day, putting the first Allied boots on the ground in occupied Europe. The 761st Tank Battalion, the unit that would become the first African-American armored unit to see combat for the United States Army, was also activated at Camp Claiborne on April 1, 1942, where it would train for nearly a year and a half before transferring to Fort Hood, Texas. By late 1943, the camp had taken on an additional mission. German prisoners of war began arriving, and the base divided into 3 distinct sections. The white American section sat near the front entrance with the best facilities and easiest access to the surrounding area. The prisoner of war compound occupied its own fenced area with dedicated buildings and infrastructure, and the African American section was pushed to the back of the camp, near the swampland, farthest from everything. That arrangement alone told a story, but the daily reality was far worse than any map could show. The roughly 1 million African American men and women serving in the United States military during World War II understood exactly what they were fighting for. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most influential black newspapers in America, had given it a name, the Double V Campaign. Victory against fascism abroad, victory against racism at home. These men and women believed that proving their patriotism, their courage, and their willingness to die for the country would finally earn them the equality that the Constitution had promised, but the nation had never delivered. Officially, the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 outlawed discrimination on the basis of race or color when selecting and training service members. In practice, African Americans served in a rigidly segregated military where they were assigned the worst facilities, denied promotions, confined to support roles, and subjected to the racial codes of whatever region they were stationed in. For those sent to the Deep South, men from Michigan, New York, Brooklyn, and other northern states who had never lived under Jim Crow, the reality was a shock that no amount of warning could prepare them for. The German prisoners arriving at camps like Claiborne carried a very different set of expectations. Many had fought across North Africa as part of Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps and had experienced the harsh conditions of desert warfare, extreme heat, chronic water shortages, and the grinding attrition of a campaign fought at the end of overstretched supply lines. Others had served on the Eastern Front before being transferred west, and they had witnessed firsthand or participated in the brutality that characterized warfare between Germany and the Soviet Union. They expected harsh treatment from their American captors. They expected deprivation, possibly brutality, perhaps something approaching the conditions they knew their own government imposed on Soviet prisoners, starvation, beatings, and labor that amounted to deliberate extermination through exhaustion. Millions of Soviet prisoners had died in German custody. German soldiers knew this, and they feared reciprocity. Some were terrified specifically of being shipped to Russia as forced laborers, a fate that would indeed befall many German prisoners held by the Soviets after the war. Drew Pearson's syndicated newspaper column reported that when the arrogance of German prisoners became unbearable, American military policemen on the East Coast would remark in German that the prisoners were being shipped to Russia from here. Issued in German, this threat quieted them immediately. They begged to remain in the wonderful United States. The journey itself was disorienting. German prisoners captured in North Africa were transported by ship across the Atlantic, arriving at American ports where they were processed and loaded onto trains bound for camps across the country. The trains crossed landscapes that staggered men who had spent years in the confined geography of European warfare, vast agricultural plains, mountain ranges, cities of a size and prosperity that seemed impossible for a nation supposedly weakened by war. The sheer scale of America was itself a form of psychological warfare, though the Americans did not intend it as such. The prisoners began to understand something about American industrial and material capacity simply by looking out the windows of the trains that carried them. What the Germans found when they arrived at Camp Claiborne was something none of them had prepared for. Not punishment, not deprivation, not brutality, comfort. On November 5, 1943, the first prisoners of war arrived at Camp Claiborne. The POW compound was surrounded by a double barbed wire fence, approximately 7 feet tall, watched over by 4 guard towers. At one inspection, approximately 80 enlisted men, 3 officers, and a warrant officer were on duty guarding 735 prisoners. A later inspection counted 90 guards for over 1,000 prisoners. Of those 90 guards, only 3 had ever heard of the Geneva Convention, the international treaty that governed every aspect of their interactions with the men they were guarding. To remedy this embarrassing gap, Lieutenant Stephen Zalawaxi held 2 classes to educate the guards about the rules. The Americans guarding the German prisoners did not even know the rules they were enforcing. The Germans, by contrast, knew the Geneva Convention intimately and were quick to cite it whenever they felt their rights were being violated. Inside the wire, the prisoners found 52 barracks, 4 lavatories, 4 recreation buildings, 3 mess halls, 1 canteen building, and 4 buildings for supply and administrative purposes. The barracks were frame construction covered with tar paper, each designed to accommodate 15 to 17 men who slept on canvas cots. Gas heaters warmed the buildings in winter, though Louisiana summers brought temperatures up to 102 degrees Fahrenheit with no air conditioning. The terrain was uneven, turning to thick mud after rain, which was frequent in a region that received 68 inches of annual rainfall. Mosquitoes were severe enough that 30 cases of malaria were reported in the prisoner compound at one point. But the physical infrastructure was only the beginning. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be given opportunities for recreation, education, and religious practice, and the United States interpreted those requirements generously. Prisoners at Camp Claiborne were paid 80 cents for a day's work. They could spend their earnings at the canteen on beer, newspapers, magazines, and other merchandise. The selection of reading material available included the New York Times, Life, Time, the Christian Science Monitor, Fortune, Reader's Digest, Newsweek, Liberty, and the Saturday Evening Post. Musically inclined prisoners formed a 20-piece band and a mandolin octet. A theatre group of 20 prisoners regularly performed comedies and light dramas, sometimes at theatres outside the stockade. Movies were shown 7 nights a week, a frequency that one Swiss inspector noted was almost excessive. A quarter of the camp's prisoners enrolled in 23 educational courses sponsored by Southwest Louisiana Institute in Lafayette. The prisoner library held 1,000 books, though 15% had to be removed because they appeared on the objectionable list, including a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf, likely hidden by a prisoner as a personal item. The prisoners planted a 7-acre vegetable garden, bought grass seed and small evergreen trees with the prisoner of war fund to beautify the compound, and constructed footbridges over drainage ditches that ran through the camp. A visiting inspector from the Young Men's Christian Association described the transformation with unconcealed admiration. When the prisoners had first moved in from the African campaign, the camp had the appearance of a desert. One could readily see that all concerned had worked hard to beautify the place, with a striking result. The inspector was describing a prisoner of war camp. He could have been reviewing a garden retreat. The prisoner population at Camp Claiborne was diverse in both origin and ideology. The camp held infantry, artillery, anti-aircraft, paratrooper, and Panzer-Armored Division veterans. Some prisoners belonged to the Sturmabteilung, the Schutzstaffel Panzer Division, Kampfgruppen, and the Hermann Goering Parachute Panzer Division units with deep ideological commitment to the Nazi cause. Among them were also men from conquered territories drafted into German service, including 33 Czechoslovakians, 47 Austrians, 24 Poles, 2 Frenchmen, 2 Italians, a Lithuanian, a Romanian, and a man from the free city of Danzig. This mix of true believers, reluctant conscripts, and foreign nationals pressed into German service created tensions within the wire that occasionally flared into danger. In April of 1945, confidential informants among the prisoners alerted camp personnel that 3 German prisoners captured in North Africa had been speaking in the barracks about an attack. When Victory in Europe Day arrived, the plotters planned to overpower the guards, seize their weapons, and kill as many Americans as possible before committing suicide. Because informants provided the warning before VE Day, camp officials were able to prepare and prevent any uprising. The director of Personnel Security Division in the office of the Provost Marshal General notified camps across the country about the potential for similar plots, and recommended that all prisoner of war camps segregate their prisoner, leaders, and spokesmen as a precaution. In another case, reflecting the ideological divisions within the wire, Private Nikolaus Weber, a prisoner from Luxembourg, reported in April of 1945 that he felt genuinely endangered because of his anti-Nazi political beliefs. The camp commander, Major Henry Draper, personally investigated and confirmed that Weber was a genuine anti-Nazi who was truly in danger from hardline prisoners. Weber was not a homosexual, not a thief, not of objectionable character, simply a man whose political beliefs made him a target within a compound that still contained committed fascists. The office of the Provost Marshal General ordered Weber transferred to Camp Butner, North Carolina, for his protection. The care taken to protect a single German prisoner's safety from his fellow prisoners would stand in devastating contrast to the indifference shown toward the safety of black American soldiers from the surrounding white civilian population. 85% of the prisoners worked outside the stockade on what inspection reports described as essential work. They worked shifts in the post-laundry running until 1 in the morning, served as shoemakers, carpenters, locksmiths, mechanics, bakers, and gardeners. They worked in kitchens, dining rooms, and administrative offices of the attached United States Army base. Their labor was valued, their skills were utilized, and when they committed minor infractions, the punishments were remarkably light. 2 prisoners who escaped after hiding under a stage during a movie were picked up walking along a highway 7 miles from camp by an American laundry worker driving home from a night shift. 2 others, who cut through the fence in June of 1944 and rode a train to Shreveport, admitted they had escaped to have a good time and not with the idea of trying to get back to Germany. Their punishment was 7 days of extra fatigue duty. And then there was the world outside the wire. German prisoners of war who left the compound for work details or approved activities entered the Jim Crow South as white men. They were white Europeans, and under the racial codes of Louisiana and every other southern state, that classification granted them access to facilities, restaurants, transportation, and public spaces that were denied to the African American soldiers who guarded them. This was not a loophole. It was not an oversight. It was the system working exactly as designed, producing a hierarchy in which the legal category of white trumped the legal category of enemy combatant. The most documented single moment of this grotesque inversion came in the spring of 1944. Corporal Rupert Trimmingham, an African-American soldier from Michigan being transferred from Camp Claiborne to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, stopped at a train station along the route. He and several fellow soldiers were hungry and tried to get a cup of coffee at the station restaurant. They were refused service. They were directed to the kitchen entrance. As Trimmingham stood outside the kitchen door, he watched German prisoners of war walk through the front entrance of the same restaurant and sit down at tables alongside white American civilians. The enemy was served by waitresses, seated in comfortable chairs, eating a full meal in the dining room. The American soldier who had sworn an oath to defend the nation stood in the back with the garbage cans. The men who had sworn to destroy it sat in the front with the silverware. Trimmingham wrote a letter about the experience that was published in Yank, the Army Weekly, a magazine produced and distributed by the United States military itself. His words carried the measured fury of a man who had absorbed every indignity a country could inflict on someone wearing its uniform and had finally found one he could not keep silent about. "Are these men sworn enemies of this country?" he wrote. "Are they not taught to hate and destroy all democratic governments? Are we not American soldiers, sworn to fight for and die, if need be, for this our country? Then why are they treated better than we are? Why are we pushed around like cattle? If we are fighting for the same thing, if we are to die for our country, then why does the government allow such things to go on?" Those questions were published in a military magazine, read by hundreds of thousands of American servicemen. They had no good answer then. They have no good answer now. The letter would go on to inspire short stories, theatrical plays, and television specials in the decades to come. Back at Camp Claiborne, the daily manifestations of this system ground on without pause. Sergeant Edward Donald, an African-American soldier stationed at the camp, provided testimony that was later published in a collection of black soldiers' wartime experiences. German prisoners of war, Donald reported, were given freedom of movement and had access to facilities denied black American soldiers. They were given passes to town when black soldiers were confined to the area and did not have their privileges. The statement described a world turned inside out, the prisoners walking the streets of Alexandria, while the soldiers who guarded them remained locked behind an invisible fence more impenetrable than any barbed wire. The bathroom situation became emblematic of the entire arrangement. German prisoners of war, classified as white, were permitted to use restroom facilities marked "Whites Only" at every gas station, truck stop, and public building where a work detail stopped. Their African-American guards were required to wait outside. The scene played out day after day across Louisiana and the South. A German prisoner walked in and used the facilities. His guard stood at the door, weapon in hand, bladder full, dignity stripped, protecting a man who had just exercised a privilege the United States denied to its own defender. Historian Matthew Schott, who spent years researching German prisoners in Louisiana, documented a broader pattern of privileges that extended well beyond bathrooms. German POWs were permitted to fraternize openly with American women, blowing kisses and exchanging pleasantries without consequence. Rice planters in Louisiana treated work details of German prisoners to seafood suppers and even provided them with prostitutes as rewards for good labor. A local Catholic chaplain and camp guards confirmed rumors of sexual relationships between prisoners and women in the surrounding communities, both black and white, though Schott noted these were rare. Prisoners could lounge at truck stops during breaks from work details, stroll through towns with relative freedom, and within their compound they could raise the Nazi flag without fear of meaningful punishment from camp authorities. Meanwhile, an African-American soldier could be arrested, beaten, or killed for sitting in the wrong section of a bus. The fraternization rules, or the lack of them, produced situations that bordered on the surreal. In April of 1945, an American soldier named Private Ivan D. McCarty was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor for drunkenness and for fraternizing with a German prisoner at Camp Claiborne. The fraternization consisted of McCarty, who was drunk, giving a drink to a prisoner at the mess hall. The German prisoner received a 30-day sentence. An American soldier was punished more harshly for sharing a drink with a German than the German prisoners who escaped the wire to have a good time were punished for breaking out of a prisoner of war camp. The hierarchy of punishment perfectly reflected the hierarchy of value that governed every interaction at Camp Claiborne and across the Jim Crow South. Some African-American newspapers raised an additional concern that cut to the economic dimension of the arrangement. The East Tennessee News voiced fears that the cheap labor of German prisoners would take jobs away from African-Americans in the agricultural regions where they had traditionally worked. Prisoners were being paid 27 cents an hour, while the prevailing civilian wage was 50 cents. A discount that made prisoner labor attractive to farmers who might otherwise have hired local black workers. The system that privileged the enemy over the defender extended beyond dignity into livelihood. Yet, despite these structural forces pushing them apart, the relationships between African-American workers and German prisoners in the fields were often marked by mutual respect. Former German prisoners, interviewed after the war by historians like Matthias Reis, spoke fondly of their African-American co-workers. The shared experience of back-breaking labor under the Louisiana sun, the shared sweat and exhaustion of field work, created bonds that the racial codes of the surrounding society could not entirely prevent. It was in these fields that the phrase emerged most naturally. The black workers and the German prisoners were, in the daily reality of their labor, prisoners of the same system, one behind barbed wire, the other behind Jim Crow. The Germans noticed all of it. They could not have missed it. And their reactions, documented through post-war memoirs, interviews, and decades of academic research would prove historically significant in ways no one anticipated. Herbert Kuhnle, a German prisoner of war who recorded his experiences in a memoir, described his growing admiration for the African-American supervisor on the plantation where he worked, a man named John. Kuhnle expressed what historians would characterize as a desire to be brown like the African-American workers he labored alongside in the Louisiana heat. The comment was not mockery. It was genuine respect, the kind that forms between men who share the same sweat and the same exhaustion, regardless of the uniforms they wear or the circumstances that brought them to the same field. Other prisoners developed a phrase that appeared repeatedly in interviews and memoirs gathered by researchers across years and camps. They called the Black Americans prisoners like us. The word surfaced again and again, captured in academic studies by historians like Matthias Rees, who documented the phenomenon across the American POW system. German prisoners recognized in the African Americans around them a shared condition, confinement, control, restriction, and the denial of basic human dignity, not for anything these men had done but for who they were born as. The Germans were behind barbed wire. The Black Americans were behind Jim Crow. Both groups understood what it meant to have their freedom stripped by a system that did not recognize their full humanity. Some prisoners pushed the comparison further into territory that proved devastating for the American re-education programs. Prisoners who participated in the democratic education courses designed to prepare them for building a post-war democratic Germany were quick to point out the hypocrisy. How could America lecture captured Germans about equality when it denied equal rights to its own citizens? Rees documented prisoners who argued bluntly that Germany's racial laws were more benign and less hypocritical than America's. The moral equivalence was false. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others bore no comparison to Jim Crow, but as a rhetorical weapon against American moral authority, it was devastating. The re-education officers running these programs had no effective counter. At Camp Claiborne specifically, Captain H.H. Barker, the POW camp commander, recommended that prisoners be shown films depicting the American way of life because they represented the best means of indoctrinating POWs. Films were screened 7 nights a week. The re-education effort also included a national prisoner of war newspaper called Der Ruf, which began publication on March 6, 1945. The paper was available in POW canteens and allowed prisoners to read articles from camp newspapers across the country presenting the American democratic way of life as the optimal framework for post-war German and European reconstruction. Meanwhile, inspectors discovered that 15% of the books in the Camp Claiborne library had to be removed because they appeared on the objectionable list materials containing embedded Nazi propaganda that had been donated to camp. Libraries from compromised collections at smaller American colleges and universities. A Swiss inspector noted that one of the books to be removed was Hitler's Mein Kampf, likely a personal item hidden by a prisoner among the library's 1,000 volumes. The Americans were trying to democratize German minds while discovering Nazi ideology still embedded in the camp's own bookshelves. But a visiting Swiss inspector noted something more fundamental than any bureaucratic failure. The prisoners seemed suspicious and felt that undue influence was being brought to bear to force American ideals upon them. The observation cut to the core of the entire re-education enterprise. The Germans were watching movies about freedom and reading newspapers about democracy, while living on a base where the black soldiers who escorted them to the theater and sold them, those newspapers could not sit in the same section of a counter. Train station restaurant. The contradiction was not subtle. It was the most visible thing on the base, and the Germans saw it clearly. The grinding contradiction did not merely corrode morale among black soldiers at Camp Claiborne. It built pressure toward an explosion that had been building since the moment the first African-American units arrived in the Jim Crow South. The camp's racial history was already scarred before the first German prisoner ever set foot on Louisiana soil. On January 10, 1942, the Lee Street riot had erupted in Alexandria when African-American soldiers from Camp Claiborne and Camp Livingston clashed with local white civilians in the streets. Conflicting reports surrounded the events, the casualties, and the injuries, but the violence was severe enough to make headlines across the country, including in the New York Times. The memory of that night hung over every interaction between black soldiers and the white community surrounding the base like a permanent cloud of tear gas. Training in the Deep South was a shock for African-American soldiers who had never experienced the region's racial codes firsthand. Jim Crow laws were not merely suggestions or informal customs. They were deeply embedded in every aspect of Southern society, enforced by law, by custom, and by the implicit threat of violence that lurked behind every interaction. For soldiers arriving from northern states, men from Michigan, New York, Brooklyn, and other cities where overt segregation was less entrenched, the rules of rural Louisiana constituted an education in a form of American life they had only heard about in the abstract. The abstract became concrete very quickly. Through the spring and summer of 1944, incidents piled up with the relentless accumulation of charges in a detonator, each one small enough to be dismissed by authorities but devastating enough to be remembered by the men who experienced them. In May, the body of Sergeant J.F. Henderson, a 23-year-old African-American from Russellville, Kentucky, was found mutilated on the railroad tracks near Camp Claiborne. He was survived by his wife. How he came to die there was never officially determined, but his death sent waves of gossip and fear through the black barracks that were worse than any official report could have been. Every soldier wondered if Henderson had been killed and placed on the tracks, or if the circumstances were what they appeared. The uncertainty itself was a form of terror. In early August, Private James Robinson, a black soldier from Brooklyn, New York, was shot and killed by the chief of police in the nearby town of Ville Platte during an altercation at an African-American nightclub. The official account stated that Robinson had shot 2 members of his own company, taken a revolver from a military policeman, and turned the weapon on civilian officers, prompting the fatal shot. But across the country, other news stories were questioning the use of lethal force by white police against black soldiers in similar incidents. Robinson's death became another data point in a pattern that every African-American soldier at Camp Claiborne could read clearly, whether the individual facts were disputed or not. Then came the allegations that would light the final fuse. In the first 2 weeks of August, 3 separate claims of assault by African-American servicemen surfaced near Camp Claiborne. A white girl claimed she was attacked by an African-American, though civilian police investigating the claim doubted that an attack had actually occurred. The wife of a white sergeant, home alone with her baby about 1.5 miles from camp, claimed she was assaulted by an African-American she believed to be from Camp Claiborne. The military report described this as a rape. A 60-year-old woman claimed an African-American soldier attempted to assault her on a highway 3 miles from camp. The local civilian response escalated rapidly. Armed white men formed a posse and rode out to hunt for the alleged attackers. They found no one, but they succeeded in sending a message that every black soldier on the base heard clearly and understood completely. The surrounding community regarded them as threats to be hunted down, not as the defenders of the nation they had sworn to serve. On August 16, 1944, a false rumor ripped through the African-American section of Camp Claiborne. 4 black soldiers had been shot by local white civilians in the bivouac area. Given the posse reported 2 days earlier, given Henderson's mutilated body, given Robinson shot dead by police, given every restaurant refused, given every bathroom denied, given every day of watching the enemy eat where they could not, sleep better than they did, and walk freer than they were allowed, the rumor was entirely believable. By evening, approximately 200 armed African-American enlisted men assembled without orders. They confronted their commanding officers and stated flatly that they did not believe the assurances that the rumor was false. They demanded to verify for themselves that their comrades were safe. Once satisfied, the main group returned to camp and turned in the vehicles they had commandeered. But 2 hours later, members of the 1328th Engineer Regiment took 10 vehicles and drove off the base. 6 men were apprehended the next morning. The mutiny escalated. 3 officers attempted to check on weapons stores. Armed soldiers ordered them out. The officers opened fire, wounding an enlisted man, but the enlisted men outnumbered them. They forced the officers to open a safe containing ammunition. They beat anyone who approached the dispensary. Military police reportedly deployed tear gas to end the uprising. 7 entire units at Camp Claiborne were disarmed. 25 men identified as ringleaders were transferred to another camp. Additional military guards were rushed to the base. Nearby units were placed on standby as reinforcements. 14 African-American soldiers faced court-martial. Private Leroy McGarry received the death sentence, later stayed. Technician 5th grade Philip Davis received life imprisonment. Sergeant Conway Price received 9 years of hard labor. 6 more received life sentences. 2 received 30 years, 3 received 25 years. 1 man, 1 was acquitted. The New Orleans branch of the NAACP contacted Thurgood Marshall to protest the trials. Meanwhile, in the POW compound, life continued largely undisturbed. The most serious disciplinary matter among the German prisoners during this period involved a Luxembourg-born prisoner named Nikolaus Weber, who was in danger from Nazi hardliners because of his anti-Nazi beliefs. The camp commander personally investigated, confirmed the threat was real, and arranged a safe transfer to Camp Butner, North Carolina. A prisoner's safety from his fellow prisoners was treated as a matter of official urgency. Black soldiers' safety from the surrounding white civilian population was treated as an irritation. And those 2 escaped prisoners who admitted they had broken out to have a good time? 7 days extra fatigue duty for the enemy. Life sentences for the defenders. After the mutiny, the African-American units had their weapons confiscated. Soldiers reported that existing orders against discrimination in post exchanges, army theaters, and military buses had never been read aloud or enforced. The Chicago Defender, through its correspondent, reported that Camp Claiborne was still seething with hate and Jim Crow despite recent War Department assurances that all was well. News of the mutiny traveled fast. The day after the incident, a New York news syndicate contacted the Alexandria Town Talk, asking whether the city had been placed off limits to soldiers because of African-American riots. The reporter from Alexandria erroneously denied that any riots had occurred. The Army's official statement mentioned only that 3 men were wounded during an altercation after a very few Negro soldiers had armed themselves from gun racks, a description that bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. When the story finally reached the national press, Secretary of War Henry Stimson was forced to respond at a press conference. He acknowledged that an investigation was underway, but disputed the scale reported in some newspapers, which had described as many as 16,000 African-American mutineers. He also denied accusations that the War Department was waiting for the presidential and congressional elections to pass before investigating. The truth lay somewhere between the Army's minimizing language and the press's inflated numbers. But the underlying reality that Black American soldiers had reached a breaking point that military discipline could no longer contain was undeniable. Multiple black units were transferred out of Camp Claiborne in the weeks that followed. 2 African-American engineering regiments, the 1324th and 1325th, were moved to Fort Huachuca, Arizona. 43 men from those units had to be removed from the train for disorderly conduct during the transfer. The Women's Army Corps detachment was relocated to what the War Department called a more suitable location. The Army's solution to racial injustice at Camp Claiborne was not to address the injustice, but to remove the people who had objected to it. But within the darkness, there were those who refused to bend. Mabel Anderson, an African-American nurse in the Women's Army Corps at Camp Claiborne, spent her days caring for white soldiers in the camp hospital. After finishing a shift, she went to the mess hall for a meal. The seating arrangement was enforced without exception. White soldiers in the front, black whacks in the middle, black men in the back. Anderson saw empty tables in the white section and sat down at one. An attendant informed her she could not sit there. She left without eating. The next morning, she was summoned to meet with the head of the mess hall, who attempted to impress the rules upon her. Anderson told him that if she was good enough to treat the soldiers in the hospital, she should be good enough to eat near them. She was dismissed. But the following day, the seating arrangement had changed. The African-American whacks had been moved to the first tables. The white men were moved to the middle. The mess hall was still segregated, but within its walls, a nurse had moved the line. After the war, a former German prisoner from Bavaria wrote back to a Camp Claiborne fireman that he would always remember how fair and kind you all treated us, so that we brought home the best impression of the people in Louisiana. The prisoner was describing white Louisiana. The impression that African-American soldiers brought home from the same state, the same camp, and the same years was carved from entirely different material. Camp Claiborne itself did not survive much longer than the war it had served. In January of 1946, the base was declared surplus to the needs of the War Department. The buildings and equipment were sold off or demolished. 30 mess halls and 20 hospital units were transferred to Louisiana State University to be converted into dormitories. The property eventually reverted to the Kisatchie National Forest. Today, only a few informational panels remain near the site of what was once a base housing 500,000 American service members and more than 1,000 German prisoners of war. The buildings where Mabel Anderson moved the line, where Corporal Trimmingham began his journey to that train station restaurant, where 200 armed men finally said, "Enough, all of it is gone." But what happened there is not. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion, who had trained at Camp Claiborne before deploying to the European theatre, went on to spend 183 continuous days on the front lines. They liberated more than 30 towns and 4 airfields. They earned roughly 300 Purple Hearts, 69 Bronze Stars, 11 Silver Stars, a Medal of Honor, and a Presidential Unit citation. General Patton himself had specifically requested them. They proved on the battlefields of France and Germany and Austria what they had been denied the chance to prove in the restaurants and mess halls of Louisiana, that they were soldiers. Full stop. Nearly 3 years after the dropping of the atomic bombs, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially integrating the United States military. The Jim Crow army that had pushed Mabel Anderson to the back of the mess hall, that had confined Sergeant Donald while his prisoners walked free, that had told Corporal Trimmingham to eat in the kitchen while Nazis ate at the counter, that army was ordered to change. The generation of African Americans who endured what happened at Camp Claiborne and at hundreds of bases like it across the country did not forget what they experienced. They carried that knowledge into the decades that followed, and it fueled the civil rights victories that would transform the nation. The men and women who had been told they were not good enough to eat in the same room as German prisoners of war went home and built a movement that would dismantle the very system that had humiliated them. The Double V campaign had promised victory against fascism abroad and racism at home. The first victory came in 1945. The second took much longer. But the generation forged at places like Camp Claiborne never stopped fighting for it. Albert Spurlock, an African-American officer in the Corps of Engineers who had served at Camp Claiborne with the 1311 Engineering Unit, lived long enough to see the transformation he had helped make possible. He said the Army became a good example of how integration can work, and that it became one of the best places in the world for a young black American who was not going to college. It was not the assessment of a man who had forgotten what he endured. It was the assessment of a man who understood how far the country had travelled and who remembered with absolute clarity where it had started.